Good afternoon, distinguished ministers, ambassadors, guests, and colleagues. It's very much a pleasure for me to welcome you today to this interactive panel discussion on diversity, inclusion, and human rights, which will explore the costs of exclusion and the value of inclusion. We're excited to be joined by this very distinguished panel and to have you with us to discuss these increasingly important themes and reflect on how exclusion based on difference can generate very significant costs, not only to individuals, but as we know, to communities and countries as well. Exclusion is frequently identified in these rooms as a root cause of conflict, underdevelopment, and human rights violations. But those of us in the room know that this is true, that it's not simply an identification. And by contrast, it's increasingly apparent and well documented that inclusive approaches that respect and embrace diversity can enhance security, can reduce poverty, and will promote human rights. We also know this to be true. Yesterday, while addressing the Human Rights Council, UN Secretary General Guterres reminded us that diversity is a source of strength for all societies and the duty of governments, all governments, to protect the inalienable rights and freedoms that are owed to all of us. Inclusion and respect for diversity are at the very heart of the Government of Canada's priorities. And so I'm very pleased to have our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Freeland, here with us today, who has joined us in Geneva to host today's panel discussion. And Minister, I have to say to you that Geneva is exactly the right place for us to be having this discussion. Through all of the various UN institutions and grassroots organizations that are based here, Geneva is the place where universal beliefs come together, and it is the true fabric of the normative human rights and humanitarian framework that we all try to advance and protect every day in these halls. Minister, your passion and leadership and commitment to promoting inclusion and respect for diversity is extremely well known, and I thank you very much for moderating the event today, and I'm going to turn the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Rosemary. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I know that this is a very packed agenda day, so I'm very grateful for everyone who has made time to join us. And I feel like I'm back to my previous job of being a journalist, because I'm used to being a moderator of things. And I'll just start by offering a few thoughts on Canada's approach to this issue. And, you know, I'll maybe start from the point that it's pretty obvious today that small L liberal values, the idea of diversity, the idea of inclusion, have made a lot of progress to this point, but also in many of our countries, in many parts of the world, there are some fresh challenges and some fresh questions being asked about these values, about their relevance, about the extent to which our societies and our communities can successfully actually accommodate diversity. And, you know, I want to be pretty humble in talking about this because I think the reality is these are challenges for all countries, very much including Canada. And, you know, there's nothing magical about our air and our water, although they are great and you should all come visit Canada, that makes us, you know, particularly inclined towards diversity. It's something that we have to work at. It's a conscious political choice by governments and by people. Having said that, we are really doubling down on it. And one of our government's mottos, and I think this is pretty much becoming a motto of our country, is to say our diversity is our strength. And I'd like to talk about three areas that as a government and as a country we're really focusing on. The first is immigration, including welcoming refugees and living in a religiously, ethnically diverse society. This is really, I think, one of Canada's greatest strengths. My city, in addition to being a minister, I'm a member of Parliament for Toronto. And my city of Toronto today, more than half of the people living in Toronto are born outside Canada. If you add people whose parents are born outside Canada, fully 3/4 of people living in Toronto either were born outside Canada or are the children of people born outside Canada. And this is Canada's biggest city. And the reason I mention that partly is to say, come live in Canada. It's great, and everyone will be comfortable and welcome there. But also to say, it can work. We really feel that we are working hard at being a successfully multicultural society, and we believe in that partly for reasons of values. It's a society that I like living in. I happen to speak a language other than English or French at home. I speak Ukrainian with my children, and my kids feel really comfortable, speaking Ukrainian with me in public, less comfortable going to Ukrainian school on Saturday mornings. They complain about that. But a lot of their friends are equally forced to go to a third language school, a heritage language, on weekends or on evenings. But what is also really important, I think, about the Canadian embrace of diversity is, as a country, we have come both to believe and experience that in addition to being kind of consistent with the kind of place we want to be, it's a real economic benefit. And one of the strong sources of public support for diversity in Canada is Canadians really think that immigrants add to our economic strength as a country. That does include refugees. One of our commitments, we had an election in 2015, and one of our campaign commitments was to welcome at least 40,000 Syrian refugees to Canada. We've done that. We're now close to 50,000. And one of the things which has been the most pleasant for me as a member of parliament. So as a member of parliament, I'm responsible, for a constituency in downtown Toronto. And in addition to being a minister, it's my job to serve my community. In the first year that we were in government, when there was a real push to bring the Syrian refugees to Canada, I would say the single biggest complaint I had in my constituency was from private groups of citizens who had formed private refugee sponsorship groups. This is a system we have in Canada where people can come together. It's often in church groups. They put money together and they take on the responsibility for a refugee family. And we found it very effective also in integration. My community is particularly enthusiastic on refugee sponsorship. And as a minister, it had one negative consequence for me as a member of parliament, which is I would have very fierce complaints from my constituents that the refugees they had sponsored had not come to Canada yet. And this was a real source of frustration for Canadians. Our Minister of Immigration actually had some protests, and the protests were that he was not bringing the refugees to Canada quickly enough, which I think is a pretty good thing to face a protest about, if you're going to have protests. The second issue I wanted to touch on that is a real priority for our country and me personally is our feminist foreign policy. And I would say feminism more generally. Daniel has pointed out, our fellow panelist, that he's in the unusual experience for a man of being a minority on our panel. It will be okay, Daniel. We promise not to interrupt you too often. This is something we really believe in. We believe in it at home, and we believe in it abroad. I think probably the most striking thing my Prime Minister did on the day that we formed government was fulfill a campaign commitment to have a 50-50 gender-balanced cabinet. And I think he surprised a lot of Canadians by actually doing that. And I must say, in my own experience as a minister, it's made a real difference. And it has a very powerful demonstration effect. My colleague, our Minister for International Development, Marie-Claude Bibeau, announced not too long ago a feminist direction for our development policy, focusing on empowering and supporting women and girls. And I do want to say that includes support for reproductive health, including safe and legal abortion. We have put $650 million behind that. Having control of your own body is an essential part of being a full citizen, and Canada believes in that at home, and we believe in that for women around the world. And then finally, I just wanted to comment on a third area that's important for us when we talk about diversity and inclusion in Canada, and that is LGBTQ2 rights. We are, together with Chile, co-chairing the Equal Rights Coalition. This is a really important area for us. It's important for us at home. It's important for us internationally. I really feel, in Canada now, gay marriage has been legal for some time. One of my colleagues in cabinet, who is a gay man, is the proud father of 2 wonderful girls, and he represents a rural constituency and has very, very strong support. So I feel we're making a lot of progress, and I really feel the demonstration effect that countries like ours, and I would speak to many countries in the room, can have in other parts of the world is so important. I was in Ukraine on December 22nd, and one of the most striking moments for me was when one of the Ukrainian journalists came up to me and showed me he had a LGBTQ pride pin, and he had been part of a pride march. And he said that Canada's example made him feel much more comfortable as a gay man in Ukraine. And what was the most striking for me was he felt comfortable saying that to me publicly in a scrum where the other journalists could see and hear him and identify him. And he said because of the high regard that Canada is held in Ukraine, the fact that Canada supports these rights made it more okay in Ukraine. And I felt great about that. And I think that's an example we should all be mindful of and mindful about supporting. And I think also, and this will be my concluding thought about Canada, that it's not so long ago that things were very different in Canada. And I think in many of our countries. There was a historic moment recently in Parliament when the Prime Minister publicly apologized to LGBTQ2 Canadians who had been explicitly discriminated against by our federal government. And many of those people were in the gallery listening to the Prime Minister, and it was very moving but also really sad to see older people whose lives had really been shattered by this discrimination just sobbing. And I'm glad that I was able to be part of a government where this apology happened. It was, by the way, supported by all parties in our parliament. So I don't want to frame this as a partisan issue, but it's also worth reflecting on how terrible things have been in our own country until really recently. So I've done a thing I never did as a moderator when I was a journalist, which is offer a few thoughts, and thank you for your patience. And now I have the pleasure of drawing out our friends and colleagues who are on this panel. So I'm going to start with Kate Gilmore. We feel very close to the Australians in Canada, Kate. We feel like we're like the cold version of Australia, or maybe you're the hot version of Canada. And she is the UN Deputy High Commissioner of Human Rights. And I just wanted to ask you to maybe share with us some thoughts on how you see diversity and inclusion fitting into a human rights framework.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Excellency. It's such a pleasure to...
You have to call me Hrestia. That's my name.
Thank you very much indeed, Excellency. Ambassador, it's a great honour to join this panel. Thank you for drawing out the connection between Australia and Canada, but we have never played curling. I mean, what is curling?
We don't even,
I mean,
we don't even
I
say
can take
playing
diversity
curling.
so far.
You
But
curl.
curling?
You curl, you don't play curl.
I think I shouldn't have said that. Ah.
It was all going so
It
well.
was going
until-
so well. And then I opened my mouth. No, honestly, thank you so very much for allowing me to join the platform and for the opportunity to emphasize how critical is this obligation to inclusion and address of exclusion in order for a prosperous, peaceful, hopeful planet. Excellencies, colleagues, friends, you know that through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, officially for 7 decades now, the world community has affirmed and affirmed again and again as its foundation stone the premise that born we all are free and equal in dignity and rights. All of us, with the exception of none of us, with the inclusion of each of us in the interests of all of us. It is not a universal declaration of human rights for your friends. It's not the universal declaration of human rights for those you know. It's not a universal declaration of human rights for those who look like you, speak like you, sound like you, or think like you. There is no basis legitimate in principle, under law, or in practice, then that can put someone beyond the reach of that foundational idea that born we all are equal in dignity and rights. And why is that true? Because try to articulate the opposite. Seriously, have a go. Try to say something counter to the idea of us born, each of us, equal in dignity and rights. Inequality, exclusion, thus are fabrications. They are man-made ruptures of our primordial state, in which, as Nelson Mandela urged us to understand, we are taught, not born, to hate. Member states have further pledged, incidentally, time and time again, that affirmation means and leads to a further entitlement that we are all entitled to a social and international order in which that foundational principle comes alive. A foundational principle we're all entitled to an international order that makes that a material condition of our lives. And I believe that it's on this basis that we have to understand that those who are governed have a first order claim on those who seek to govern, that the governor's first order duty, their founding duty, is to create such an order whose fabric, unruptured, is woven thread over thread, warp and weft, from an inalienable, unswerving, uncompromised, universal duty. First and foremost, the claim on the executive, on the legislature, on the public policy maker to uphold this foundational principle that born we all are in equal dignity and rights. Friends, you know, the self-interested political misconstruction of the governance project as being other than for that purpose is a loss leader in our world. The leading drivers of unmanageable, unaffordable costs in currencies of casualty and calamity are today's toxic claims by the governor to govern first for country rather than for people, to govern for growth economies rather than for fair societies, to govern out of narrow political self-interest rather than for social cohesion, to govern for borders rather than rights, for nationalistic interests minus a common duty to a common concern for a common planet, specifically this planet which is affected by conflict, challenged by crisis, changing because of climate instability. These are outmoded, historically redundant, afactual, and these nativist efforts to get the better of us by appealing to the worst of us betrays the very essence of governance. By definition and intent, nativist discourses of fictionalised monoculturalism for exclusion, in defiance of inclusion, are today's most caustic eroders of peace and prosperity, specifically in a globalised world on a shrinking planet that's antithetical to freedom, to dignity and well-being, and it's wasteful, bringing unconscionable costs in the form of human suffering, depletion of human talent, undermining of social contribution, eroding productivity. History in this is a harsh teacher. Do we have to be taught yet again that communities organised around the exclusion of others and against inclusion invariably are unjust, unfair, inefficient, wasteful, wrong in principle and dumb in practice? Just to be very clear, the caustic byproducts of that nationalistic nativist approach don't wait in line for national passports before carrying their toxicity far abroad. There is no version of national policy in a globalised world where it runs against these founding principles of our common humanity. There's no version of that policy that stays behind borders, is imprisoned by walls, or contained by barbed wire fences, no matter how high, no matter how deep. This, in fact, was one of the lessons of the Millennium Development Goals. Yes, extraordinary progress was achieved by many measures, that we must acknowledge. But at the same time, over the course of that same decade and a half, inequality deepened and broadened. One thing did become more inclusive, and that is inequality. And by the stratifying identities for which there is no place for such inequality, by gender, by age, by sexual orientation, by race and ethnicity, by religious identity, by indigeneity in terms of people with disability. By every measure, those stratifications worsened because we cared not to count them, we cared not to report on them, we cared not to monitor them, and we cared not to hold ourselves accountable for them. It may be the case that member states are reluctant to run more efficient, productive, inclusive societies. But I want to caution that people are not going to wait. You know, from Venezuela to Tunis to Cairo to Hong Kong, and in the harshest of places as well, Bangui, Juba, Gaza, Damascus, people themselves are acting in and on their worlds that they experience as marred by these ruptures of discrimination and inequality. And they are doing so increasingly beyond the immediate reach of those who claim to govern. And they are insisting and organising, sometimes not constructively, but are organising in resistance of the failures of leadership. It's important that their agency in this be celebrated, because people are not development's problem, they are development's purpose. They may not be seen as such, but frankly, people are not only development's end, they are the central means by which we can advance a peaceful and prosperous society. There is a desperate need to put people at the centre of the project of governance, locally, nationally, and internationally. And in this, by way of final remark, I want to emphasise the importance of civil society. You know, without a voice for that diversity and pluralism, that nationalistic and nativist discourse would seek to silence, you know what would have happened? There would have been no end to slavery. There would have been no address of HIV and AIDS. There'd be no public exposure of child sexual assault perpetrated in churches, in football clubs, in the United Nations. There would be no legislative change against child marriage or rape and marriage, no access to emergency contraception, no protection of endangered species. We need pluralism. Transformation has never come from obedience. It's never come through orthodoxy. It has always come through challenge and being challenged. And you may torch every book, you might char every page, you might burn every free word to ash, you may gag the dissenter, you might lock up the pen holder, you may throw away the key. Try as they might and try as they do. I just want to be very clear. The human spirit, in all its diversity and pluralism, it's incombustible. And therein, well, there lies false powers, deepest fears. But therein we find our most renewable resource and our greatest hope. Thank you.
Wow, I knew I liked Australians. Thank you very much, Kate. I know you used to work for Amnesty International, and you've made me really feel like we should all be out on the barricades somewhere.
That's the plan.
And so let's have this be like our UN-ish type barricade. No, thank you very much for that call to action, and I especially like your point about the role of civil society. Absolutely essential. And I have to say, you know, now as a minister, civil society can really empower us. Civil society can inform our work, and it really empowers our work. So to everyone here who works in civil society, thank you very much. You help us know what the right thing is to do, and you help us have the courage of our convictions. Okay, we're going to move on now to Diana Carolina Prado Mosquera. Thank you very much for being with us. She is a UN Program and Advocacy Officer and also a longtime advocate with the International LGBTI Association. And I think we would all be interested in your comments on this important issue, maybe particularly with an LGBTQ lens.
Thank you very much. It's a little bit difficult to be talking after the Deputy High Commissioner, so I'll try to follow up on that. First of all, we would like to thank to the Canadian government for this invitation or for the creation of this event. We have been following up this initiative since last year with the meeting at the Permanent Mission of Canada, as well as the side event that you held last year, as well as the joint statement that you had last year here. For us, as an organization who is currently working on LGBTI issues, we consider that societies, as well as the Secretary General said, that are inclusive and respect diversity are a source of strength. Particularly from my personal point of view, I think that this discussion has never been more relevant. Though we know that inclusive and diversity is important, currently there are governments that find diversity and inclusivity a threat to what they call their values. So we see violence and discrimination against people based on their religious belief, based on their country of origin, and based also on their sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. The Deputy High Commissioner has named two very important instruments. The first one was the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, but also she referred to the previous instrument, which was the Millennium Goals. I'll be referring to the Sustainable Development Goals. These two are perfect entry points to talk about the cost of exclusion. And before I start talking about this, I would like to mention, when we think about exclusion, we're talking about perhaps economic, economy and the economic impact that it has in the world. We would like to express that when we're talking about inclusion and exclusion of LGBTI persons or any individual in the world, we don't need to talk about an economic cost. Just because we are all free and equal in dignity and in rights, it should be enough. So having said that, Yes, when we were trying, or when I was trying to frame for this panel, I was trying to look for information with regards the cost of exclusion or policies that talk about inclusion. It was quite difficult to find that accurate information and data. Why? Because currently we are lacking of that information. So part of my very small intervention will be about of the lack of information that we have. Throughout the world, LGBTI persons have made efforts to raise awareness on violence, discrimination, and exclusion of LGBTI persons based on their sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. Nonetheless, even though that there have been a lot of efforts from civil society organizations, and we see it, for example, when we as civil society organizations need to compile information for you governments in the UPR process, we don't have data. Why? Because our governments don't have it. So at the end, we need to come up with a specific survey or a specific study that allow us to explain why exclusion is not working, why we are needing inclusive measures, programs, public policies. So yes, this is a major issue for us, and this block progress toward inclusion and the realization of human rights. Nonetheless, we wish to have more policies that included or talked about inclusion, to say it in a way. So, for example, that Deputy High Commissioner just mentioned something. We decided not to count on them, and we decided not to report on them. And I think the UNDP thinks exactly the same. Is when people are counted, no one is left behind. And that is why it's so important, the premise of the SDGs of leaving no one behind. And as some of you might know, the UNDP is currently creating a LGBTI Global Inclusion Index, which compiles data around the world. I'm not going to talk further about this, but I'm going to say that they have decided to highlight 5 key specific areas, and I will be addressing 3 of those areas to share with you a little bit of examples on when we talk about the cost of exclusion and the benefits of inclusion. So the first one is personal security and violence. So when we talk about this, we often see that LGBTI people face violence and discrimination. We had yesterday the chance to listen to the High Commissioner talking about a situation in Indonesia. It was about the brutal situation that transgender women face because they were humiliated in public. In the Aceh province, they were beaten, their hairs were cut just because of their gender identity. And this is not the only case. And as most of you know, ILGA, my organization, often calls these cases of violence and discrimination under the item 4 of the Human Rights Council, situations that require the attention of the Council. And we are constantly receiving this type of information of violence and discrimination. Unfortunately, we don't have data where we can go and say, here are the cases of violence and discrimination, and here are the cases or the follow-up or implementation of those specific cases. So that is a cost of exclusion effectively. Also, when we have, for example, governments who actually have talked about hate crimes and have hate crimes legislation, but they decide not to include and not to count the discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, that is also a challenge for us, and that also is part of the cost of the exclusion. Then we have, in the case of LGBTI persons, specifically the education. When you talk about access to education, it's important for any individual, including, of course, LGBTI person. Why? Because this has an impact in other dimensions, and one of those dimensions, but not the only one, is economic empowerment. So as I had told you before, we don't have a lot of examples, so I excuse myself because we usually like to give examples from Global North and Global South, but unfortunately, for this specific case, it shows the lack and the gap of research and data that we currently have. So in the case, for example, of the United States, there was a survey that was carried with LGBTI students. That survey showed first that half of the students to 2/3 of the students had been victims of bullying in school because of their sexual orientation, gender identity expression, and sex characteristics. From those students, 1 out of 3 students have dropped school because of being bullied because of their SOGIESC, which is, again, the cost of exclusion. Then, when we are talking about, for example, inclusion, there are many different issues that you as governments, we as civil society, and you as other stakeholders can implement. So, of course, the educational system needs to be able or to be apt for LGBTI persons. This includes policies of inequality as well as measures to combat bullying, stigma, and discrimination. So, for example, what can teachers or counselors can make when they are having LGBTI students? They can help on this, and they can promote a culture of inclusion that at the end will allow LGBTI students to develop essential skills necessary for fulfill the life will lead to productive societies. Then when we talk about economic well-being, what the little research that currently exists shows is that LGBTI people are highly vulnerable to poverty. Because they are cut off opportunities. If you don't have access to education, it's not possible. If you're not even able to present to a job because you don't have the adequate identity that the government or that the private company requires, then that becomes an issue when it comes to economic well-being. So as a matter of fact, and again, quoting the United States a survey carried with LGBT youth said that 40% of the homeless youth in the United States are self-identified as LGBTI and queer persons. That's a lot. Another fact and another consequence of exclusion. Earlier, we talk about the situation in Indonesia. Indonesia is a country that, as we all know, lacks of anti-discriminatory laws on employment. There is a widespread bullying among students, and there are major health disparities in LGBT persons. There was a study carried by the pilot study carried by the World Bank, which said that the cost of discrimination of LGBTI persons in Indonesia can cost nearly 900 million to 12 billion US dollars yearly. I'll conclude by saying what are the personal costs of this? Are personal tragedies that include isolation and rejection, many times are deep scars. What are the costs for society? It's enormous waste of potential of talent, creativity, and productivity. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Diana, for that. I really like your emphasis on the need to count and measure. I think one thing we can learn from the private sector is what gets measured is what gets done, and what doesn't get measured is what is ignored. And I also really took note with your point that, look, I believe, speaking for Canada, I think we believe as a country that being a successful, diverse, and inclusive society helps us to be a prosperous society, but that's not the reason to do it. Ultimately, this is about the dignity and the rights of each individual person, and I'm really glad you underscored that. I think that's very, very important for us to remember, so thank you very much. Okay, now you guys are going to think that I rigged this, but we're going to move to another Canadian, and not a former journalist, but a current journalist, Hiba Ali. She is director of Iran News, and has spent a decade reporting on conflict zones in the Middle East, Africa, and Central Asia, before doing the terrible thing that happens to journalists, which is you're moved into management if you're too good and have too much fun reporting. And I would really like to ask you, Hiba, to talk a little bit about what you've seen in the field, the way that you see these issues playing out, particularly in areas of conflict.
Thanks very much for having me. And Kate, I'd love to know who writes your speeches. Maybe you could lend them to us from time to time. Right, so we are a news organization that specializes in covering humanitarian crises. We've got journalists in crisis zones around the world, and our bread and butter is looking at both what leads to crises, the crises themselves, the after effects of crises. And very often what we're seeing is that before something becomes a crisis, there are very clear warning signs, and they are often linked to exclusion and marginalization. I can give you one really obvious example. You've all heard, I'm sure, of the Chibok girls of Nigeria, the schoolgirls who were kidnapped and who Michelle Obama was, among many others around the world, involved in advocating for. They were kidnapped by a group called Boko Haram, which is now also alleged to have kidnapped another 100 girls that the Nigerian government is currently searching for. Boko Haram is never gets quite the attention that ISIS and other militant groups get, but is actually behind one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world today. Violence linked to this militant group has killed 25,000 people, which is huge over the last 6 years or so. Displaced 2.5 million people. It has led many people to have to leave their farms and no longer have their source of agriculture and livelihoods, move into food insecurity, and destabilize the entire region. So quite a kind of powerful force in terms of the implications of their actions. And we are the only news organization that I'm aware of that has actually interviewed active Boko Haram militants. We got into one of the prisons in Nigeria where they were being held and spoke to these guys. And what you find is that the root of their radicalization is a feeling of alienation. These are people who come from poor communities, who aren't well integrated, who don't have access to the same level of services, who feel they have nothing to lose. And that makes it a zero-sum game and makes it really easy when someone comes and offers you a few $100s to join some group and have some sense of belonging. And often it's actually not the financial gain, although that's generally a part of it, but that feeling of being part of something, even if it's something horrible and something very destructive. And I think if you look at most conflicts around the world today, that is somewhere at the heart of it. I myself, as the minister said, used to be, well, I still consider myself a journalist, but I do more budgeting and strategy than anything else these days. But when I was reporting, a few years ago, I was in Kenya speaking to the family of a young boy who blew himself up in Somalia as a suicide bomber with Al-Shabaab. And sitting there with this family in a really rural part of Kenya where they had no education, no opportunities, and speaking to his friends and saying what led him down this path. And it always comes back to that same thing. There was really nowhere else where he felt he was going anywhere in life. And the moment, I think it's been made clear by other colleagues, the moment that we allow our societies to descend into that kind of feeling of exclusion, you open yourself to huge risk, which isn't only a domestic problem, but as we see, becomes a regional and global problem. If you look at ISIS today, obviously, this is something that is terrorizing the entire world, and trace that back, and you'll end up in a similar starting point. And so I guess maybe one other point I wanted to make around how we come at this as journalists and where we see our role in this picture of pluralism. I'm, as you said, a proud Canadian, and frankly, it is really nice to be Canadian in this day and age, where we see our government taking this kind of approach to these issues, so thank you. You make us walk with our heads high, which hasn't always been the case, and I think, like everyone, we have our challenges too. But as journalists also, and the minister can share this with me as well, our role is really to create that kind of empathy among people and to help people understand that the other is not so very different from them. And so at IRIN, what we try to do is to, speak to somebody who may well be living in, Texas in the United States, and help them understand that the farmer in Somalia or the refugee in Myanmar has, at the very basis, the same desires and needs as he does. They want to put food on the table for their children. They want to help them get an education. And once you start to be able to develop that kind of empathy towards someone, inclusion becomes a whole lot easier. When I was in the second year of my journalism program in Canada, we were given a little assignment by our professor to help us understand what journalism is all about. And he said, I want you to spend a day in someone else's shoes and then write about what that was like. So I decided to dress up as, well, I am Muslim, but to actually wear the headscarf and spend a day wearing a kind of traditional Islamic gear and pretending to be an immigrant. I'm born and raised in Canada, but my parents are immigrants, and certainly, you know, that experience resonates with me. So I got onto the bus, pretending I didn't speak any English, and kind of fumbling around and seeing how people would engage with me. And to be honest, people were quite decent. It is Canada after all. But it was a really terrifying experience, and it makes you feel so insecure and so vulnerable and so outside of the in crowd. And now every time I meet an immigrant, you can be damn sure that I make an effort to help them because I've understood what it's like to be on the other side of the fence. And so, you know, in the absence of us all being able to do that kind of experiment, although I encourage you to do it, you know, journalism can try to give you that window into someone else's experience and create that empathy, and then hopefully lead to more accepting societies. I think maybe a last couple points on how that plays itself out. Our family was among the many Canadian families that sponsored a Syrian refugee family. And what you hear from people who've done that is that once we met these people and had a relationship with them, suddenly we viewed the refugee issue completely differently because we had that human connection. And what we're seeing in a lot of the xenophobia today around the world in terms of response to migration is also linked to that. If you remember the very early days of the flows of migrants from particularly Syria, but not only Syria, into Europe, the headlines on some of our less responsible journalistic news organizations like the Daily Mail in the UK had things like swarms on the streets. And I remember this article that was making the case that these asylum seekers were ruining the UK tourists' experience in Greece because they were all over the place and the poor British tourists weren't able to enjoy their holiday. And then a few days later, when a 3-year-old boy drowned on a beach in Turkey, and that photo of a young kid face down in the sand made headlines around the world, suddenly we saw a very different kind of approach. And that same newspaper was talking about the human tragedy of the refugee experience. And overnight, actually, refugee policy in Europe and in many other countries transformed. And I'm sure my colleague from UNHCR will speak about this as well. But you can, again, see the role that a little bit of empathy from responsible journalism, which is not always the case these days with the cutbacks in the news industry, can play in trying to encourage more inclusive and diverse societies. So maybe I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, well, thank you very, very much, Heba. And I especially love that idea that the central project of journalism, in your view, is about creating empathy. I think we all know, current journalists, former journalists, and consumers of journalism, this is not a truth universally acknowledged in our profession, and I think that's a real shame. And I think those personal experiences in empathy are so incredibly important. As you were talking about your teacher, it reminded me of an experience I had as a student, also actually as a school child in Canada, where in my elementary school, they had actors come in, and the children, we all were divided into groups, and we had to pretend to be immigration officers. And we had to decide who to admit and who not to admit of these actors. And I remember at the end, the lesson was cut off because we children were so upset that we couldn't admit everybody. And we protested and we said, we want to change it. We want to let everybody come to Canada. And it was a very good lesson. I've always remembered it. So good teachers are important too. And I do want to make a point to Heba's point about, being visibly Muslim. It's something as a Canadian member of Parliament and a minister that I'm concerned about and our government is concerned about. Islamophobia is a real concern. We hear from Muslim Canadians about their very real worries, and it's something we're certainly committed to working hard to be sure at home in Canada that all Canadians, very much including Muslim Canadians, feel comfortable and feel safe, whatever they wear. Okay, Daniel, this was not intentional discrimination that we left you to the end. You know, you have had such deep experience in very difficult circumstances working with refugees, and you have real insight into that. Also, I love your job. You're Director of Resilience and Solutions. I think all of us should be directors of resilience and solutions. Really looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. And thank you, first of all, for giving us space to talk about refugees. And thank you very much, Hiba, also for this really compelling account about refugees. You portrayed that much better than I could. And above all, I have to thank Canada for being such a beacon for refugees worldwide. That's really keeps also our hopes up. Because there are 25 million refugees, 65 million forcibly displaced, so 25 million refugees and 40 million internally displaced, and 86% of the refugees live in low and middle income countries who are already struggling in receiving refugees. And I think we can see over the last decade, we have seen different approaches. We have seen countries that saw refugees as an opportunity. They had a compassion, and they included refugees in their communities and in their societies. And we have seen countries that were more afraid or scared of refugees, and they kept them either in reception centers, in isolation, or in refugee camps. And we have looked carefully at the two different experiences. We have seen that, you know, the exclusion of refugees and keeping them in refugee camps normally meant they had no right to work, they had no freedom of movement, they had dedicated refugee schools that over time, because they depend on humanitarian funding, which is very limited, became worse and worse. And also their health services and other services were very limited. We saw generations who lived in camps, children who are born in camps, who know nothing but waiting for the monthly ration as their goal in life, and who probably have a worse education than their great-grandparents when they came into the country because the funding is running dry. So it is really, from a human rights point of view, from a dignity point of view, a not acceptable situation. And therefore, it was particularly important to see that in 2016 at the General Assembly, there was, the New York Declaration was passed for refugees and migrants. And in that New York Declaration, there was an agreement to deal differently with refugees, to allow for inclusion of refugees in communities, to make camps the exception, and to help host countries in doing so. And I think we have seen also not only the moral evidence that this is better. The World Bank has done a 150-page study demonstrating that countries who include refugees in their host communities actually have 6% greater increase in that region than countries who keep them excluded. And that over time, inclusion also pays off economically and from a development point of view. And as many of the host countries who are practicing inclusion have said, it is also a benefit for them in terms of security management, because you don't have alienated communities. So we have now been applying what we call a comprehensive refugee response that looks at this new policy in 13 countries. And I would like to give two examples. One is Uganda, that has a policy of complete inclusion. Refugees, when they arrive in Uganda, have the right to work, freedom of movement, they can build companies, and they have access to the local schools and local health facilities. So they live like Ugandans. And actually the president said, Uganda is the richest country in Africa the richest in refugees. So they see refugees as an asset. And it has also shown that in the last year and a half, Uganda has received more than 1 million South Sudanese. That would have normally been a major catastrophic event, but thanks to the inclusion and thanks to the collaboration of the local partners, this has been relatively well managed. So it's also, even in such a catastrophic situation, a better way of dealing with refugees. Another country that has had an encampment policy and kept refugees in camps, but who wants to change, is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has about 900,000 refugees, most of them in camps, and they are not allowed to work, not allowed to leave the camps. And Ethiopia has committed that within 10 years, they will close all the camps and allow refugees to have freedom of movement, access to government school, and be constructive assets of the community. This is remarkable and a major shift in international policy. And I think what really is important here is that it takes two to tango. If you build, a refugee school in a camp, it's probably a tented school or a tented school that costs $1,000 or $2,000. But if you build a government school, extend government schools, you have to invest more in the beginning. But it will last, and it will be owned, and it will be managed. And I think this is the example where we have to bring what we call the whole of society to contribute to the effort of including refugees. That's not only the humanitarian actors, but also development actors, the World Bank, private sector, of course also individuals and the civil society, local and international. And that is really the aim that we pursue, and I think we can already show very strong evidence that this new approach works. And finally, as you know, we are working on a global compact for refugees towards the end of this year. This will be a major milestone. If we have, the global compact agreed, this will be a further reinforcement of this policy, and I think we can really see a major shift. And obviously, we need countries as inspiring as yours to support this. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you particularly for those specific examples. People have been saying such nice things about Canada, which of course I love, that I feel for the sake of truthfulness and also an appropriate humility, it's worth pointing out two things. One is, we are really proud of welcoming, particularly of the Syrian refugees, and continuing to be a country that welcomes refugees generally. And building on a historical legacy helps. So, one of the most moving examples of private sponsorship of Syrian refugees that I've seen in Canada has been the private sponsorship program was invented when the Vietnamese boat people came to Canada. And there are now families who came to Canada as Vietnamese refugees who are in turn sponsoring Syrian refugees. And it's a great example for everybody, and I think for those Syrian refugees also to see that it can really work. And in fact, our Minister of Immigration came to Canada himself as a Somalian refugee when he was 16 years old. But Daniel, the examples that you've given us from Uganda and Ethiopia in their numbers are a reminder for us as Canadians to have real humility. We are fortunate in our geography when it comes to refugees. And although we're very glad to have now admitted almost 50,000 Syrian refugees, that pales in comparison with the challenge countries like Jordan, countries like Germany are facing, and I want to be mindful of that. And I do also want to say, we haven't touched on this in this context, but as a Canadian, I feel our biggest human rights challenge is the treatment of the Indigenous people in Canada. I think it's something very many Canadians, very much including our government, feel we need to get right, and that we haven't gotten right so far. And we are really working on it, and we're committed to getting it right. And, Daniel, the final thing that I really found inspiring in your remarks, and I think it's sort of a thread that has gone through what everyone has said, is, it's important to respect the human rights of each individual because that's the right thing to do. And I think that's what we would each want for ourselves and our children. But what's also great is, very often in life doing the right thing is hard and comes with costs. In the medium and long term, when it comes to inclusion and diversity, doing the right thing actually makes us more prosperous and brings tremendous benefits. It's actually more costly to do the wrong thing. And, I'm cautious about advancing that argument because I think rights are important in and of themselves. But I think we now have enough empirical experience to show that peace and prosperity and human rights and prosperity really do go together. Now, I think
We also have a few people in high positions of power who think in a transactional manner and might benefit from that kind of argument.
But it's really true, though, right? Like, all the examples everyone has given really show that that is actually the case. I've shown myself to be a really crummy moderator because I think we're meant to be wrapping up. And there was supposed to be panel discussion. Do we have time for questions? Yep. Okay, so we have time for a few questions, not too many, because I think we're supposed to end at 1:25, right? Okay, so we have a grand total of maybe 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Please, and could people introduce themselves? I'm sure all the Genevaites know each other, but I don't know people.
My name is Linda McDonald. I'm a Canadian, and I'm a proud civil society member. I'm also a challenger. That's why I'm here. And I'm here promoting the rights, the human rights of women and girls who've endured non-state torture, which is torture perpetrated by parents, human traffickers, pimps, those not employed by the state. And they're discriminated because they can't have their crime named under Article 5, the same as state torturers, in our country and in Canada and in many countries. And I'm also a feminist, so the power of naming is very important. And as you mentioned, Diana, we don't have enough data on persons who have endured non-state torture because it's not named as a crime in many countries, although it is, Ms. Gilmore, in Queensland, Australia, which is positive. So I'm asking you, Ms. Freeland, or anyone on the panel, to think of the impact of this discrimination on women and girls, and some boys and men, who can't name their suffering accurately. They don't have the empathetic embrace of our country or other countries that haven't named non-state torture. What is the impact on them and on our society?
Okay, well, thank you for that question. And, I'm just being warned that at about 1:15 or 1:20, I'm going to have to go, although people can keep on talking because I have to do my human rights speech, which will be great. I have some thoughts on that, but I'd also like to hear from my colleagues. And Kate, Australia has had a shout out. Do you want to offer some reflections?
Well, no, I mean, I don't want to speak as an Australian. I haven't lived in the country for 20 years, and of course I'm not meant to speak on behalf of Australia. But let me just observe that, in fact, the human rights mechanisms have done a lot of work, ma'am, to advance the idea beyond the state of obligations to those standards that, in fact, at the end of the day, still fall to the state to adjudicate. We can't outsource law, we can't outsource courts, even where cruel, inhumane behaviour tantamount to torture is perpetrated by non-state actors, still the state has a responsibility for fulfilment of human rights. So I don't think they're as separate as sometimes it feels. Further, the UN has articulated guidelines for economic actors specifically on this matter. In addition, the various human rights treaty body committees in more recent times have recognised rape in marriage, child sexual assault, exploitation of minors, child labour and so on as potentially tantamount to torture. So I think the normative framework has finally begun to come alive, inclusively of women and children. But it is, your point nonetheless holds a lot of water, that somehow we've privileged a public domain responsibility for upholding human rights, when human rights belong from the courtroom to the bedroom to the schoolroom. They belong everywhere, and inclusively of women and children in the private domain. Thank you.
Anyone else want to have a go? Yeah, okay. And I'm really going to second Kate's remarks. I think it's a really good observation, and you know, I think once you start pulling at the thread of human rights and inclusion and diversity, it makes you realize how much there is still left to do. And I think you've really effectively highlighted an important area that, as it happens, no one on the panel touched on. So thank you for being here. Okay, sir.
My name is Hassan. My name is Hassan Shira. I'm also Canadian. I hope this not others may not see that this as a setup. The minister have to only ask Canadians to comment on this. But I'm talking about. I'm a human rights defender heading a program for protection of human rights activists in the continent in Africa, in Kampala specifically, where you mentioned Uganda. I just want, first of all, how happy I am. I'm joined with Ms. Ali to see, first of all, our foreign minister at this type of gatherings. Our mission, my ambassador hosting us in her home and her embassy to talk about the future of Human Rights Council. So this is where Canada belongs, and you have came. But I just want to put some forward-looking agenda, even though I will kind of speak to your subordinates as well, is that Canada adopted a measure for the protection of human rights defenders globally, which means the guidelines. That guidelines need now local implementation strategy, so that our missions outside needs to know what protocols they have to adopt in order to engage with human rights defenders at risk on the ground. Similarly, the European Union did that. Secondly, to invest money for the protection of coalitions. In Africa now, we are disabusing the notion that, like me, the way I did when I had challenge in Somalia to run to Canada, not to go to anywhere except in the continent. So we are building hub cities in the continent, whereby human rights defenders from Burundi now, and there are a large number of them outside their countries, could go in Ivory Coast and to continue to study law or whatever they were doing. Those hub cities needs also some kind of leveraging and connecting to maybe perhaps Canada. And I should be urging that Canada have to walk to the talk and see frontline journalists now in a place where there's armed conflict, where they need a protection gears, where all these handles need some kind of leveraging in terms of financial support, apart from the diplomatic support. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Hassan. And I promise we didn't seed the room specially with Canadians. Maybe Canadians are just specially interested in this issue and came. Does anyone have any comments on that other than me? No? Okay, I think those were two really good points, and particularly on the local implementation strategy and the EU's example. We'll follow up on that, because I think, one of the things that I think is so important in this work is to learn from each other. And, I think there are some like-minded countries and actors in the world, and I think we should try to advance together and not feel like we have to invent it all for ourselves. And I like the hub cities idea too. So, Rosemary, can you work on that?
Absolutely.
This is the great thing about being a minister. You can just ask other people to do all the work. And I see my team is leaving, so that means I better leave too so I can make my remarks. And let me just say thank you very much to everyone here for your work and engagement. And thank you from me to the panel. Just because I'm leaving doesn't mean people have to. I think there's another 10 minutes if people feel like carrying on. And I think our excellent ambassador is prepared to assist in that effort.
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you all very much. I mean, we have an extraordinary panel with Jan and Daniel and Kate and Eva. But, you know, I think the three things that really resonated for me was that the issue of inclusion isn't going to happen by accident. I think we all heard that today, that it's a purposeful choice and it takes a lot of work. It's an investment. The second, it takes leadership at all levels to create a culture of dignity and a culture of empathy to others. That was important language. And the third is that the cost of exclusion should be very clear. We shouldn't have to keep showing it, but in fact we do. And so the empirical foundation for what we all believe in, we need to keep proving it. And so the importance of documentation and data is important. And while we can believe that it's there's costs and benefits, I think that what I heard from Diana, I heard from others, was the need to collect that data. And it's what we all want. At the end of the day, we want, you know, prosperous, innovative, resilient, healthy, safe communities. That's what we want. And we believe in our country that the pathway for that is a progressive, inclusive, open societies that not just respect and not just tolerate differences, but absolutely embrace them, because that's what makes life interesting and what makes our societies so healthy and built for the future and built for all of the challenges that face us. So let me thank all of you very, very much for attending, and very much a thanks to this very diverse perspectives of the panelists, but with that hardcore of I think embracing, you know, the agenda of an inclusive society. So thank you again. Thank you all.